We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
This is Houston. Say again, please.
Houston, we've had a problem.
Welcome back to this co-video edition of Space Junk Podcast. We are crossing live today to Canberra, where I'm meeting with the fabulous Malcolm Davis from ASPI. Malcolm, it's so great to talk to you. How are you holding up in Canberra?
Look, things are going well. ASPI actually shut its building, so everyone is now working from home remotely for the foreseeable future. It could be many months before we go back into that building, so we're all kind of hunkering down and getting on with work as best we can using online information, and we've brought some books home as well. So work is getting done. ASPI is still doing great things, and I'm still keeping busy talking about things like space power and space policy and also a bunch of other things. So there's a lot to work on.
That's good to hear. Now tell us, well, I obviously know you, but for people who have not met you or had the pleasure of hearing you speak, particularly international listeners, or viewers, I should say, who are you? What do you do?
Okay, I'm Senior Analyst in Defence Strategy and Capability at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute in Canberra. Now, ASPI, as it's called, not ASPI, but ASPI, is Australia's leading think tank on defence and strategic policy and national security. And I'm the resident space geek at ASPI in the sense that I do a lot of the space policy and space security stuff. Amongst other areas. So I've been with ASPI since 2016. I've had a variety of appointments prior to that in academia and also government. And my main career is as a strategic analyst.
Right. How have things changed in the time that you have been working in this sector in sort of space security?
Look, I think that when I remember back to the 2000s, before really major power tensions spiked in 2014, firstly with the Russian invasion of Crimea and then the Chinese moves in the South China Sea. I think prior to that, there was this perception of space as sort of global commons, a peaceful sanctuary where everyone worked together and there was cooperation. I think that's gone. I think we're now moving from space militarization to space weaponization. It's a much more competitive, contested environment. There's this phrase that is used in the space policy community that space is contested, congested, and competitive. Everyone uses it repeatedly. But it's true. Space, I think, has become far more contested because all the major powers are now developing counter-space capabilities, anti-satellite weapon systems. The US has developed Space Force in response to Chinese and Russian moves in a similar vein. So I think space has changed away from the sort of perception of this peaceful sanctuary that is, global commons towards a more contested, potentially a warfighting environment. And so from a space policy analyst perspective, I'm now focusing very much on how we deal with that and how we manage the potential challenges and risks ahead.
It's very interesting how we respond to the increasing numbers of vehicles in space and the increasing interest in space resources, not just in the sense of asteroid mining or something, but in the sense of space, like literal orbital slots and so on. And I think it is a real challenge. It's not something that was necessarily thought of when the Outer Space Treaty was written. But at the same time, I do think that increasing congestion and contention and competition, that was too much. I should have gone with the classic. But anyway, I was in too far. But I do think that is in its own way also encouraging activity in space that is more cooperative and collaborative and coordinated, if I might throw in my own C words.
Look, I think that's right. I mean, with the congest and competitive aspect, I think there is more cooperation in the legal and the regulatory front, because everyone is now aware that space is becoming contested, congested, and competitive. And so we're trying to actually mitigate the risks. And the way we're doing that is to recognize that a lot of the space law and space regulation was created back in the 60s and 70s when things like commercial space and Space 2.0 and new space simply didn't exist. And so a lot of that space law, including the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, is dated and outdated for the current era, and looking forward in the future when you are going to have a lot more commercial activity in space, not just in the LEO to GEO environment, going out to the cislunar environment and asteroid mining and space resource utilization and so forth. So we're now in a determined effort within the space policy, the space legal, and the regulatory environments to try and update or bring in new laws and regulations that don't stifle that development, that don't actually constrain that development, but at least manage the potential for conflict and competition that could lead to actual military conflict in space. And I think that's a really positive development. So on the one hand, you've got this negative development of more potential risk from counter space capabilities, but on the other hand, you've got a positive development in terms of states and organizations working together to try and solve it through space law and so forth.
Right. So there's this push from the private sector as well as from governments to try to figure out what we're doing and have clearer rules of the road, I suppose.
Yeah.
I mean, in a way, when I read the Outer Space Treaty, there's this underlying current of international tension between governments. The whole thing just reads like a, hey, Soviet Union and America, let's not bomb each other, which is probably not the most brilliant thing to say, because obviously this is 1967 and a core part of this treaty is designed to make everybody calm down and not take their arms race into space. That's a really key bit to it. But I don't think, so I think in that sense, to me, the treaty is not outdated in that we still have international tensions, and those international tensions can still benefit from not putting nukes in space.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I totally agree with the private sector and commercial interest in space, that is really not something that is covered in the Outer Space Treaty in any major way, except maybe the provisions which say that that it's up to governments to manage the activities of non-governmental entities within their country. So, you know, I think that's useful sometimes for us to remember when we're thinking about Bezos or Musk or something, that they are held to some standard through that. But totally, I think it can encourage really good development, particularly like with space traffic management or, you know, areas such as that. Sorry, you were saying?
No. I was just going to say that, I mean, the Outer Space Treaty was brought into effect to avoid putting nuclear weapons in orbit, which was being considered at the time. And secondly, because we recognized that we were going to go to the moon, and there was consideration of how do you use the moon for military purposes. And so the Outer Space Treaty was designed to prevent that from happening. And I think that, you know, we've moved on from nukes in orbit. Everyone understands that from a tactical military perspective, they're a non-starter anyhow. It's not worth doing. The moon and other celestial bodies is a more challenging issue because, yes, states per se will probably observe the Outer Space Treaty's requirements there and not militarize the moon and other celestial bodies. But what if they're commercial actors operating on their behalf? So, for example, a Chinese state-owned enterprise decides that it wants to claim a resource on the moon and it wants to protect that resource. It could then bring in private security companies to protect that resource, and by that way circumvent the Outer Space Treaty in terms of its provisions on not militarizing the moon. Because how do you determine what is military activity on the moon and what is not? And I think this is the problem. The Outer Space Treaty's language was written at a time when private actors in space simply didn't exist. And so where it needs to be updated is, I think, is that aspect, is how do we deal with private sector operating in space and the potential blurring of the boundaries between state and non-state actors operating in space in a way that could generate conflict and competition.
Well, one of the ways that the Outer Space Treaty and then later the Moon Agreement, which, as you know, is my all-time favorite treaty, attempted to deal with this concept of blurring of lines between military and non-military uses of the moon is to write into the treaty principles around inspection rights on a basis of reciprocity. So the Moon Agreement goes into some detail on it, and it's quite similar for any nerds out there to the Antarctic Treaty provisions around basically you can go and, you can organize to go and inspect someone's base and have a look around and check that they're not doing anything that you think is dodgy. And in theory, your right to do that is mirrored by their right to do the same to you. And through that way, you have transparency. But in the Outer Space Treaty, because most of the world has not seen the light and signed up to the Moon Agreement, we've got Article 10, which I thought it might be worth having a chat about.
Yeah.
Yeah. So shall I read it?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Just because not everyone has the,
Yeah,
has it right.
I don't remember it word by word, but I'm sure you do. So
I'm getting close. Article 10. In order to promote international cooperation in the exploration and use of outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, in conformity with the purposes of this treaty, the states parties to the treaty shall consider on a basis of equality any requests by other states parties to the treaty to be afforded an opportunity to observe the flight of space objects launched by those states. The nature of such an opportunity for observation and the conditions under which it could be afforded shall be determined by agreement between the states concerned.
Okay, so basically what that says in simple terms is states reserve the right to inspect other states' space activities. Let's put it in simpler terms. Yeah. And I think that's perfectly legitimate. And it's something that we do now on a regular basis. We have very capable space surveillance capabilities, including here in Australia at Exmouth in Western Australia. And I think that the next step in that regard, in addition to the ground-based segment of that, is space-based space surveillance capabilities, which all sides are working on. And the potential then to actually have an understanding of what everyone's doing, certainly in the LEO to GEO environment, is real. I think going out to cislunar space for space surveillance is probably a key step forward we have to think about. Particularly as we look out at the end of the 2020s and into the 2030s, and you've got commercial activity going on out there, and you have companies and states trying to compete at a commercial level for profit and market share and resource access and so forth. Having that space surveillance is really critical. So, if we're concerned about the Chinese using the moon for establishing a foothold up there in terms of economic activity and dominating the high ground. And I know a lot of people don't like the high ground terminology, but I think it's apt. If we're concerned about that, then we need to actually understand what's going on out there. And so having space surveillance, and that space surveillance backed up by regulatory arrangements and legal arrangements, is really critical.
Well, when I read this article, there's something quite beautifully old-fashioned about it, in the idea that we could send a letter to someone asking if a diplomat could be given an invitation to a launch, and that's our way of having people view what's going on. But it's this multi-step process, whereas these days this idea of doing it in person in this very slow way is somewhat out of date, because launches happen very frequently, and because the issue is less the launch and more what the object is and what its capabilities are. I think at this time there was a real concern over making sure that there were no nukes going into space.
Yeah.
And so if you can observe, then you can say, oh, that looks like a nuke. Whereas, now it's actually, you'd probably need to get into the software much more than the hardware to understand what was going on. And
it's not just the launch from Earth. It's also what's actually happening in space. So if we're talking about the period of the future and say the 2020s and the 2030s, you're going to have in-space manufacturing. So how do we control the use of space-based resources that fuel and run space-based 3D printers that are manufacturing hardware in space? And that could include manufacturing satellites in space from space-based resources. So that where that Article 10 kind of falls apart is that it's written for a very 1960s paradigm of space activities. In the 2020s and the 2030s, it's going to be a completely different world out there, where you have commercial lunar bases doing space-based manufacturing, utilizing space resources. You have reusable rockets and aerospace planes, perhaps by the 2040s, that launch at with the aerospace plane type technology, allowing you to launch like an airliner. You step on an aerospace plane, you go up to low Earth orbit. So it's that launch cadence that's much faster rather than traditional 1960s expendable rockets. It's the fact you've got commercial presence right through the Earth-Moon system that is doing things on a daily basis. So how do you monitor all of that? And I think this is where Article 10 probably just is not relevant, and it needs to be, updated, or we need a new outer space treaty, dare I say it, that is written for the modern era. I
would challenge that one, because I actually think that Article 10 has never been relevant. The people who wrote this treaty and signed it would have to have known that this idea that you would ring someone up and then ask for an invitation to watch a launch and that was your observation of what they were doing was always a sham. It was always a pretense or a formality, because both sides were spying on each other constantly. Yeah. So of course, through espionage, they would have already known a lot about what was being launched, maybe not everything. But this treaty just establishes a principle of we should not be totally secretive. Yeah. And I think that principle is still relevant today because, again, we've got such good observation. Like, we've got satellites with such good resolution that in theory, no one can be secretive anyway. Yeah. But at least we've got this principle that says that we will not be totally secretive. And that's actually it's nuanced. I get it. Like, I'll agree. And it's subtle. And maybe I'm being too charitable towards Article 10, but, we're early in this COVID thing and I don't want to get angry at my outer space treaty just yet. Right. But I do think that that's a reasonable concept. It acknowledges that observation is probably occurring, while in a very neat way saying, well, that's okay. And I wonder, these days, how do people, back then we all know what they did. It was like James Bond stuff, right? It was people kind of sneaking around and taking little photographs of plans or sneaking into nuclear facilities and somehow not dying, things like that. But these days, how are we doing that sort of thing? How do countries check on each other?
Well, I mean, to the extent that we can in the LEO to GEO environment, we have ground-based space surveillance, where we have telescopes and sensors on the ground that are looking up, and we can see into GEO, for example. We can monitor activities, so we can monitor Chinese and Russian satellites that are closing in on our satellites and try and work out what they're doing. We have space-based space surveillance systems, in other words, satellites that look at other satellites and do the same thing. We use electronic intelligence and signals intelligence to monitor electromagnetic activity up in space and try and gain information that way. And of course, we use the traditional methods of intelligence on what is happening in the Chinese space program. So we might use a variety of national technical means, as they call it, as well as human intelligence there. So we have all of that at the governmental level. We also have at the commercial level a degree of commercial activity that does something similar. You might have heard of the ComSpot, which is a commercial activity that kind of looks at space activities and provides a nice interactive map of what's happening. And you can go to the Analytical Graphics International website and you can actually see it there. And then you have the amateur satellite watching community, which are doing great work. These guys, these men and women are even imaging the X-37B space plane, which is the top secret US military space plane that goes up and does stuff.
What's a space plane? How is that different from a satellite?
A space plane is like a mini space shuttle. So it's reusable. So the X-37B has had 7 flights now. and the US Air Force flies them, and they go up and they might stay for 600, 700 days on orbit doing stuff. I don't know what they do. It's all classified. But basically everyone understands it's space surveillance and gathering intelligence. And then they re-enter like a space shuttle and land, and then they're refurbished and sent up again. So that's a sort of like a very early style space plane that, in the 2040s, you'll see it much more like, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey, but that.
Are you kidding? Of course.
Yeah, I figured you would. I wasn't sure because you're very young, but it was. But the point was that in 2001 you had this fantastic sequence where you have the space shuttle going up to the space station, and it's basically in that sequence that it's a space plane. It launches on its own, flies into space, delivers its payload, and comes back and lands and does the thing again. So that's the future we're heading towards, I think. But where we are at now, I think, is reusable rockets, which is the key advance. But spaceplane technology is there as well. And so I think you've got, to get back to the point I was trying to make, you've got amateur satellite watchers that are watching this thing and getting really useful information on satellites and space activities. So you've got a range of actors there, all involved in watching what's happening up in space. And I think that's really useful. And so to take it back to Article 10, the basic principle underlying it is still valid. We need to be able to understand what's happening in space. It shouldn't be completely secretive. But the process that Article 10 implies is completely outdated. And I think, what we need is to either develop a new treaty from Article 10 that covers space domain awareness, or, as I said, we need to have a new outer space treaty or something that brings the outer space treaty into the 21st century.
Yeah, I think that the non-binding guidelines are one way that countries are continuing to agree new things, like the ones on debris mitigation in 2007. Now, that one did make me feel very young, because did you know that those guidelines started being negotiated in 1994, which is the year I was born? And it didn't finish getting agreed until 2007 when I was in high school, which is kind of fascinating. But that long process of negotiation of these guidelines, which are after all non-binding, so everyone was a bit like, if you look as an outsider, you think, well, what's the point? But they've actually been mostly followed, and they're setting up customs of behavior and norms of behavior that are quite useful. And I actually think that maybe when it comes to space traffic management and management of what's being put in space, the fact that we've got people in their backyards with telescopes that are good enough to see what's going on might be the thing that keeps things under control. Far more so than a bunch of lawyers in a room negotiating.
And I think that sort of distributed architecture that you're talking about there, in terms of the very low end amateur telescope side of things, that can be replicated across a nation. I mean, you and I visited at the Avalon Airshow last year. We visited a display where they had these essentially what were amateur telescopes, commercially available telescopes for amateurs, celestron sort of thing, that have been adapted into observing satellites by, I think from memory it was observing changes in the background sky or something like that. I forget the actual term.
Oh, was this the Western Sydney University
Yes,
people?
Yes.
Fabulous technology. I forget the name of the people, but it's basically, instead of looking at what's there and then trying to pick out the satellite, it just looks at what's there and it sees what's moving. So it's based on the way that some other animals see.
Exactly. So if you imagine replicating that at a national level, you could have a very sophisticated space surveillance capability for very low cost, something that could be done commercially rather than run by government. And I think that's the sort of technology approach that what we need to do to sort of really update our space surveillance capability beyond what we have now. But at the same time, the legal and the regulatory structures have to be updated with it, because otherwise we've got a 1960s legal regulatory environment with a 21st century technology, and it just doesn't work together.
Yeah. I'd like to ask you about hypersonic weapons.
Yeah.
Mostly because I don't know a lot about them, and you do know a lot about them, and I have you here in this moment,
Okay.
and I would like to ask. But before we got on to that, I wanted to flag that Malcolm mentioned the Avalon Airshow last year. That was actually the site of the recording of the podcast with the worst sound quality of the entirety of Space Junk podcast history. Yeah, Malcolm and I recorded this podcast in this shed on the airfield in the middle of an air show with a demonstration of Defence Force dogs doing attacks next to us. And it is truly dreadful. And it was on my old microphones as well, so it's even worse. But if you can stand it, I recommend not using headphones. If you just play it from your phone or from your computer through the dodgy speakers, it sounds a lot better. But I do recommend listening because Malcolm had some really interesting things to say then when we spoke. And if you're enjoying this conversation so far, you will enjoy that one. Plug over. Hypersonic weapons.
Yeah.
What are they?
Okay. All right. Hypersonic weapon, or the term hypersonic implies traveling at a speed that is 5 times the speed of sound or greater. So in other words, anything from Mach 5 upwards to around about Mach 25. So a Mach 1 is the speed of sound. Mach 5 is when you're at hypersonic speeds and you go up from there. And most of the hypersonic systems people are looking at now are between Mach 5 and Mach 10. So 10 times the speed of sound. So we're looking at 2 different types of technologies at this point in time. Hypersonic glide vehicles that are launched on a ballistic missile and then essentially skip along the top of the Earth's atmosphere or within the Earth's atmosphere like a glider. Essentially that system is designed to deliver weapons at very high speed from very high altitude, and it's virtually unstoppable. And it has the ability to maneuver radically, which makes it different from a ballistic missile. Ballistic missiles are already hypersonic weapons, but they follow a set ballistic path.
Right, so they move in a parabola.
Yeah, whereas hypersonic weapons can move, trying to use my hand here. Hypersonic weapons.
Like, I'm thinking, how do I think about this?
We're like real fighter pilots here. I mean, sort of like, I could. Like so yeah, hypersonic weapons can dodge. They can move back and forth.
But that makes sense because they're moving in 3 dimensions rather than in 2. Like a parabola would be, it's like a straight line but a curved line. Whereas if you think about it, if you've got the atmosphere as a sphere, then you can bounce in a straight line, but you can bounce sideways. There's no reason you can't keep bouncing around.
And it makes it much more difficult to intercept. And of course, it's still coming at a very high speed. So, many thousands of kilometers per hour at very high altitude and then descending on a target.
And high altitude, that means that it doesn't have as much drag or gravity.
Yeah,
as well.
Air resistance.
Air resistance is the thing. Yeah. And so it's kind of just gravity, pinging off bouncing off the atmosphere, is it?
Well, it's within the atmosphere. Okay, right. So but it's at very high altitude. So most hypersonic weapons are probably coming in at 70 or 80,000 feet, which is a very high altitude. I think also that in addition to hypersonic glide vehicles, a little further down the track are hypersonic cruise missile systems, and these use what's known as supersonic combustion ramjets or scramjet engines. And essentially, what these are air-breathing rockets, and they fly at hypersonic velocities at lower altitudes. And most of these systems are designed either to attack a land target or a naval vessel at sea. And once again, they can maneuver radically, but their speed is what really is their effectiveness. So with traditional anti-ship missiles, we'll detect it several minutes out, and we have time to try and shoot it down. Hypersonic weapons, once it appears, it's within seconds, it's hitting your ship. So there's no actual time to shoot it down.
How fast? It's very hard for me to try to imagine something going at Mach 5. What's the fastest? Can you see it at Mach 5?
You can see it. I mean, particularly on infrared because it's heating up, so it'll glow like a bright object. So that may be our best way to track it.
Okay.
And the US military in their 2019 Missile Defense Review report said that the best way to track hypersonic weapons is from space using space sensors to detect the atmospheric glow as the weapon goes through the atmosphere. You're talking many thousands of kilometers. So to put it in the old imperial terms, the speed of sound at sea level is 760 miles per hour. So times that by 5 and you get the beginning of the hypersonic realm. Go up to 10, you're talking 7,600 miles per hour for Mach 10. You get the idea. And
right,
I
so
think
it's not logarithmic, it's linear.
Yeah.
Cool.
So think about very high speeds, maneuverability, and also when it hits, it doesn't need a huge explosive warhead because the kinetic energy alone does the damage. So if you're talking a ship at sea, this thing hits at say Mach 10, it's going to sink the ship, and there's no time to defend the ship against the weapon. The third aspect of hypersonics that I would mention is the potential for, as I said, going back to space planes and accessing space. If you can develop what's known as combined cycle propulsion, where you have something that starts out as a turbofan engine like you see on a regular airliner, and you take off on that, and you reconfigure it in mid-flight into a scramjet once it gets at a high enough speed of about Mach 4, Mach 5, and it flies on the scramjet until it needs to go into space, and then reconfigures it into a rocket, and then flies into space. You've got the basis then for a space plane, and the potential then for airline-style efficiencies in terms of operations to space daily, both for people and payload. That sort of technology gives you and I the ability to get on a plane in Sydney and fly to London in 4 hours, or it gives us the ability to get on a space plane in Sydney, fly up into low Earth orbit, dock with a commercial space station, do what we're wanting to do, and come back and land under our own power in London. And so you have that transformation in the space launch sector that is probably as great as what reusable rockets are offering in the 2020s. So that's a civil commercial application, but obviously it has military application as well, because if you imagine the Space Force that President Trump has established, what they'll be able to do with aerospace plane technologies in the 2030s and the 2040s for actually doing stuff in space that resembles military activity, you have a really interesting possibility there.
Do you think it will be developed, assuming this technology is developed, would it be developed first by military or first by commercial entities?
It's being developed by military first, and it's not the US that's leading, it's the Chinese and the Russians that are leading. The Chinese have deployed the the DF-17 missile, which is a hypersonic glide vehicle. The Russians are developing Kinzhal and Avangard, which are hypersonic glide vehicles. The Americans are trying to develop hypersonic weapons to try and catch up. But at the moment, it's the Chinese and the Russians that are leading, and it's with military applications. The civil applications, I think, are there on the horizon for high-speed commercial air travel. So instead of sitting in a metal tube for 24 hours and feeling miserable in economy, you get to London in 4 hours and you're feeling fresh and ready to go.
I reckon some of those airlines would still make you feel miserable by the end. Probably like any distance in United is Delta.
But that revolutionizes air travel, but it also opens up space access, and I think it's the space access that really excites me. The potential, probably in the 2030s, I'd say at the earliest, to be able to have space plane technology that we can deliver people and payload into space really contributes to that industrialization of space and the growing space economy. So if we're out there doing space manufacturing, using space resources, lunar bases and so forth, if we can have a quick, cheap, and easy way into low Earth orbit, that suddenly is the missing piece of the puzzle in terms of making us a spacefaring, multiplanetary civilization.
Yeah. Malcolm,
did that help?
That does help. It has been so good talking to you and hearing your expertise on all of this.
Yeah.
If you had something that you wanted people watching this to go away and Google or think about or read or listen to or watch or whatever you feel is right, what would that be?
Look, I'll give a shameless plug for the Australian space sector here. I think that people need to keep an eye on what's happening in Australia. I know you've got overseas listeners. The Australian space sector is really booming. They're doing fantastic things down here. We've gone from a space sector in, say, 2010 that had nothing, essentially, where we were completely dependent on the US to provide everything, and we provided a suitable piece of real estate for ground facilities. We've gone from that to companies now developing launch vehicles, building launch sites, developing satellites, talking about, we're Australian Space Agency's now involved in Project Artemis to get US astronauts back to the moon and onto Mars. We're engaging much more widely internationally in terms of with international partners. We're encouraging the next generation of space thinkers through STEM education. I think that your listeners need to keep track of what's happening in Australia, because we are a new space power with old roots that go back to the days of Woomera, but we are a new space power that is moving rapidly ahead, and there are exciting times ahead for us. And so I've often said this to you, there's never a better time to be a space policy analyst in Australia than right now, because now is when things are starting to happen. And I think the next decade is going to be really exciting for Australia. And in that broader scheme of things, we're keeping a watch on what's happening internationally and the sort of things we've talked about today in terms of space law and space regulation and the challenge of space surveillance. I think this is all starting to become a really exciting area. So for people who are looking at careers in space, the potential to get involved in space policy and space activities and space security issues like you and I are never better. So you and I are very lucky in that sense.
I'd agree with that. Absolutely. Malcolm, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.